"I'm not the beautiful girl you ordered," said the saloon maid, her voice trembling like autumn leaves before a storm. The half-blood tracker smiled, eyes holding secrets the frontier had long forgotten. "You're exactly what I seek," he replied, and in that moment, two broken souls found what neither knew they were searching for. Arizona Territory, near the settlement of Copper Ridge, late autumn, 1879. The stagecoach rumbled through red dust that hung in the air like powdered rust, coating everything it touched with the color of dried blood and broken dreams. The wheels creaked over stones and ruts, each jolt sending shudders through the wooden frame, as 6 horses labored against the incline leading into town. Beyond the coach windows, saguaro cacti stood like silent sentries against a sky so blue it hurt to look at, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the relentless sun. Inside the coach, Ruby Jane Sutton pressed her palm against the scarred side of her face, fingers tracing the puckered skin that ran from her right cheekbone down to her jaw. The burn had happened 3 years ago in a kitchen fire back in St. Louis, when the orphanage where she'd worked had nearly burned to the ground. She'd saved 2 children that night, but the flames had taken something from her that could never be restored. Beauty, they called it, though Ruby had never possessed much of that particular currency, even before the accident. She wore a simple grey dress, mended at the elbows and hem, the fabric sun-faded and road-worn from 2 weeks of travel. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, a few escaped strands curling against her neck in the oppressive heat. In her carpet bag rested everything she owned: a spare dress, undergarments, a hairbrush with missing bristles, a small Bible her mother had given her before dying of consumption, and a letter. The letter was the reason she was here. It bore the name Miss Evangeline Rose Harrington, a woman Ruby had met exactly once in the St. Louis boarding house where they'd both sought temporary shelter. Evangeline had been beautiful, golden-haired and porcelain-skinned, with the kind of face that made men stumble over their own feet. She'd received a proposal from a man out west, a settler seeking a bride through one of those matrimonial agencies that connected lonely frontiersmen with Eastern women seeking fresh starts. But Evangeline had changed her mind at the last moment, running off with a traveling patent medicine salesman who'd promised her stage lights and applause in San Francisco. She'd left the letter behind, along with a train ticket and a note scrawled in hasty script. "Take it if you want it. I'm done with dusty territories and savage country." Ruby had taken it, not out of deception, not really, but out of desperation that tasted like copper in her mouth and felt like claws around her throat. The orphanage had closed its doors. Her small wages as a laundress had dried up. Winter was coming, and St. Louis held nothing for a scarred woman with no family and fewer prospects. The West, she'd heard, was less particular about appearances. It needed strong backs and willing hands more than pretty faces. So she'd packed her bag, boarded the train, and tried not to think too hard about the man waiting at the other end. A man expecting someone else entirely. The stagecoach driver's voice cut through her thoughts. "Copper Ridge, folks. Last stop before the mining camps." The coach lurched to a halt in front of a weathered depot, its paint peeling like sunburned skin. Ruby gathered her carpet bag, her hands trembling as she adjusted her bonnet to shade more of her face. Through the dust-streaked window, she could see the town sprawling before her, a wide dirt street flanked by false front buildings, a saloon with a crooked sign, a mercantile, a blacksmith's forge sending sparks into the afternoon air, and clusters of people going about their business in the peculiar slow motion of desert heat. The driver opened the door, and Ruby stepped down into the Arizona sun. It hit her like a physical force, dry and scorching, so different from the humid summers of Missouri. The wooden platform creaked under her boots. She could feel eyes on her immediately, curious stares from townspeople lingering near the depot. A woman in a blue calico dress whispered something to her companion. 2 men in dusty work clothes stopped their conversation to look. Ruby's hand instinctively rose to her scarred cheek, then she forced it down. She'd learned long ago that covering it only drew more attention. She saw him then, standing apart from the small crowd near a hitching post where two horses waited. Damon Warbear was impossible to miss, not because of his height, though he was tall, or his build, though his shoulders were broad beneath a worn leather vest. It was the way he stood, utterly still in a way that suggested he could wait forever, if necessary, rooted to the earth like the ancient saguaros dotting the landscape. His skin was the color of burnished copper, his hair black as obsidian and hanging past his shoulders, bound loosely with a strip of leather. He wore the clothes of a frontiersman, dark trousers, a faded blue shirt, a leather vest decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the light, and boots that had walked more miles than most men dreamed of traveling. A knife hung at his belt. His face was angular and weathered, marked by sun and wind and something deeper, something that looked like old sorrow worn smooth by time. Their eyes met across the dusty space. His were dark brown, almost black, and they held hers without flinching, without the quick look-away she'd grown accustomed to. For a long moment neither moved. Ruby felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the weight of the deception pressing down on her shoulders like a stone. This was the moment. This was when he would see that she was not the woman from the photograph, not the golden-haired beauty who'd promised to be his bride. She walked toward him slowly, each step feeling like she was approaching the edge of a cliff. The dust puffed up around her boots. Behind her, she heard the stagecoach driver unloading luggage, heard the murmur of voices, but it all seemed distant, muffled, as if she and this man existed in a separate world carved out of the shimmering heat. "Mr. Warbear?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, barely audible above the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. He gave a single nod, his expression unreadable. "You must be the woman from St. Louis." His voice was deep and quiet, with a slight accent that rounded certain vowels, a remnant of another language spoken in childhood. Ruby's throat tightened. Her hand clutched the handle of her carpet bag until her knuckles went white. "There has been a mistake. I'm not the beautiful girl you ordered. The woman in the photograph, Miss Harrington, she changed her mind. I took her place. I should have written, should have told you, but I had nowhere else to go, and I thought—" The words tumbled out in a rush, tripping over each other in their haste to confess, before courage failed her entirely. Silence fell between them like a curtain dropping. A tumbleweed rolled past, pushed by the hot wind that carried the scent of creosote and dust. Somewhere a horse whinnied. Ruby could feel the stares of the townspeople boring into her back, could almost hear their thoughts. Fraud, deceiver, desperate woman with a ruined face trying to trap an honest man. Then Damon Warbear did something that made Ruby's breath catch in her chest. He smiled. It was small, barely lifting the corners of his mouth, but it reached his eyes, softening the hard edges of his face. "You're exactly what I seek," he said simply, the words falling between them like river stones, solid and true. Ruby blinked, certain she'd misheard. "But I'm not her. I'm not beautiful. I'm scarred and plain, and I lied about who I was." "I did not ask for beautiful," he interrupted gently. "I asked for honest work and a steady heart. The agency sent me a photograph of a woman I did not know, and words written by someone else. They told me she would cook and clean and bear children, as if a woman were no different than livestock, to be ordered from a catalogue." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "You came here knowing you would be refused. You came anyway. That tells me more about your character than any letter could." Ruby felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're not angry? You're not sending me back on the next stage?" "The next stage doesn't come for 3 days," he said, and there was the faintest hint of humor in his voice. "Plenty of time for you to decide if you want to stay. This is hard country, Miss Sutton. It doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't care about pretty faces. But it has room for people willing to work and learn." He gestured toward the horses. "My ranch is 6 miles north of town. You can see it first before deciding anything. No promises, no obligations. Just truth between us from this moment forward." Ruby looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. Kindness, yes, but more than that. Recognition, as if he knew what it was like to be judged by appearance, to be dismissed before being known, to carry marks that told stories others refused to read. "I can work hard," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm good with mending and cooking, though I've never cooked over an open fire. I can read and write and do sums. I don't complain and I don't quit easily. And I promise no more lies. Whatever comes, you'll have the truth from me." He nodded, satisfied. "That's all I ask." He moved to take her carpet bag, but she held onto it. "I can carry my own things," she said. Another small smile crossed his face. "I don't doubt it. But the trail is rocky and you've been traveling for days. Save your strength for tomorrow. The ranch has plenty of work waiting." This time, when he reached for the bag, she let him take it. His hands were calloused and strong, marked with old scars across the knuckles. He secured her bag to one of the horses, then turned back to her. "Can you ride?" "Not well," Ruby admitted. "I've been on a horse maybe 3 times in my life." "Then you'll ride with me. Juniper here," he patted the second horse, a grey mare with intelligent eyes, "is gentle, but the trail has places where one wrong step means a long fall. Better to be safe." He mounted his horse first, a large buckskin gelding, then reached down his hand to her. Ruby hesitated only a moment before taking it. His grip was firm and warm as he pulled her up behind him. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her balance, and she could feel the heat of him through his shirt, could smell the scent of leather and sage and smoke that clung to him. "Hold tight," he said, and then they were moving. The horses' gait smooth and steady as they left Copper Ridge behind. They rode in silence for the first mile, following a trail that wound between towering red rock formations and scattered junipers. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the rocks in shades of orange and gold. Ruby had never seen landscape like this, so vast and open, so empty of the familiar markers of civilization. No church steeples, no factory smoke, no neat rows of houses, just earth and sky and stone, stretching endlessly in all directions. "It's beautiful," she said softly, not sure if he could hear her over the sound of hoofbeats. "It is," he agreed, "and unforgiving. The beauty here has teeth. Rattlesnakes, scorpions, heat that can kill you in hours without water, cold that can do the same at night, flash floods in the canyons, drought that lasts for years. People come out here thinking the land will bend to them, but it's always the other way around. You learn to bend or you break. Which did you do?" Ruby asked before she could stop herself. There was a long pause. "Then both. I broke first. Then I learned to bend. Now I'm still here, which is more than most can say." They rode on, and gradually Ruby felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The rhythmic movement of the horse was soothing, and the heat, though intense, felt cleansing somehow, as if it were burning away the accumulated grime of her old life. Behind them, Copper Ridge disappeared from view. Ahead, the trail led deeper into the red rock country, toward whatever waited at the end of this unlikely journey. "Why did you ask for a bride?" Ruby found herself asking. "A man like you could find a woman without sending away for one." Damon was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then I am half Apache, half white. My mother's people see me as too white. The settlers see me as too Indian. I exist in between, belonging fully to neither world. Most women in town cross the street when they see me coming. The others, the ones who don't cross the street, they want something I can't give, to be civilized, tamed, made into something I'm not. I thought a woman from far away, someone who didn't know the territory or its prejudices, might see me as simply a man. Not a half-breed, not a savage, just a man trying to make a life." The honesty in his words struck Ruby like a blow. She tightened her arms around his waist slightly, a gesture of understanding. "I know what it's like to be judged before you open your mouth, to see people's faces change when they see your scars, to be dismissed as damaged goods." "You're not damaged," Damon said firmly. "You're marked. There's a difference. Damage can be repaired or discarded. Marks tell stories. They're proof you survived something that tried to destroy you. Ruby felt tears sting her eyes again, but this time she didn't fight them. They rolled down her cheeks silently, absorbed by the dry air almost as soon as they fell. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Not the orphanage matrons, not the other laundresses, not the few men who'd courted her before the fire. They'd all treated her burn scar as a tragedy, something to be pitied or hidden. But Damon spoke of it as if it was simply part of who she was, no better or worse than any other aspect of her existence. As the sun sank lower, they crested a rise, and Damon pulled the horse to a stop. "There," he said, pointing toward a valley below. Ruby looked and saw a small ranch nestled against a red rock cliff. There was a main house built of adobe and wood, its walls the same rusty color as the surrounding stone. A barn stood nearby, along with a corral holding several horses. A well with a wooden frame marked the center of the yard, and she could see the silvery line of a creek running behind the property, bordered by cottonwood trees that provided the only significant shade in sight. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. It was small, isolated, and somehow exactly what Ruby had imagined when she'd held that letter in her trembling hands back in St. Louis. "It's not much," Damon said, echoing words spoken 100 times by men showing women their frontier homes. "The house has 3 rooms, main room with the kitchen and fireplace, bedroom, and a small storage room that could be converted to another bedroom. The roof is solid. The well water is sweet. The land supports a small herd of cattle and enough crops to get by. I have contracts to supply beef to the mining camps and to track for the territorial marshal when needed. It's a simple life, but it's honest work. It looks like a home," Ruby said softly. And it did. Not grand, not impressive, but real solid, built to endure. They rode down into the valley as twilight gathered in the corners of the sky. By the time they reached the ranch, the first stars were beginning to appear, sharp and bright in the darkening blue. Damon dismounted first, then helped Ruby down. Her legs trembled slightly after the long ride, and she had to grip his arm for a moment to steady herself. "The outhouse is behind the barn," he said, practical as always. "There's a wash basin inside with fresh water. I'll tend the horses and start a fire. You must be hungry." Ruby realized she was starving. She hadn't eaten since a hurried breakfast at a way station that morning, some 12 hours ago. "I can help with the meal, if you show me where things are." "Tomorrow," Damon said. "Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow we can talk about how things will work. If you decide to stay." He led her to the house and opened the door. The interior was dim, lit only by the last rays of daylight coming through 2 small windows. As her eyes adjusted, Ruby saw a space that was clean and orderly, but unmistakably lonely. A table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace with cooking implements hanging beside it, shelves holding tin plates and cups, a rocking chair near the hearth. Everything was functional, nothing decorative except for a woven blanket hanging on one wall. Its geometric patterns in red, black, and white, speaking of skilled hands and patient work. "That was my mother's," Damon said, seeing her gaze. "One of the few things I have from her. She died when I was 12. Influenza took her in 3 days. "I'm sorry," Ruby said, and meant it. He nodded, accepting the condolence. "The bedroom is through there. It has a proper bed, mattress stuffed with corn husks. I'll sleep out here by the fire tonight. In the morning we'll figure out more permanent arrangements. If you're staying, I'm staying," Ruby said, the words coming out before she'd consciously decided to speak them. But once said, she knew they were true. She had nowhere else to go, yes, but more than that, she didn't want to go anywhere else. Something about this place, this man, this vast empty country felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. Damon looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable in the gathering darkness. Then he nodded once. "Good. I'm glad." He turned to start the fire, and Ruby stood there in the doorway, her carpet bag still in her hand, watching this stranger who had become something else in the space of a few hours. Not quite a friend, not yet a husband, but perhaps the beginning of both. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and the desert night fell fast and complete. Inside, fire sparked to life, pushing back the darkness, warming the small space. Ruby set down her bag and moved to help without being asked, finding bread and dried meat in the cupboard, setting the table with practiced efficiency. They ate in comfortable silence, too tired for conversation. When the meal was finished, Ruby washed the plates in the basin, while Damon banked the fire for the night. She bid him good night and retreated to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. The room was small but adequate, with the promised bed, a trunk, and a small table holding an oil lamp. She lit the lamp with a match from the tin beside it, and warm light filled the space. Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, testing its firmness. Not soft, but not uncomfortable either. Through the thin wall, she could hear Damon moving about, settling in for the night. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her spare dress on a peg, placing her Bible on the small table. Her hands trembled slightly as she did so, and she realized she was shaking not from fear, but from something else entirely. Relief, perhaps, or hope, that dangerous commodity she'd tried so hard not to indulge in during the long journey west. She changed into her nightgown and braided her hair for sleep. In the lamplight, she caught her reflection in the small mirror hanging above the trunk. The scar was vivid in the golden light, twisting down her cheek like a river of damaged skin. She traced it with her fingertips, remembering the pain, the fear, the moment when she'd pulled those two children from the burning kitchen. She'd never regretted it, not once. But she'd paid a price, and the payment showed on her face for anyone to see. "You're marked," she whispered to her reflection, repeating Damon's words. "Marks tell stories. They're proof you survived something that tried to destroy you." For the first time in 3 years, she looked at the scar not with shame, but with something approaching acceptance, maybe even pride. She had survived. She was here. And tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but she would face it as she had faced the fire, with courage, even if that courage trembled. Ruby extinguished the lamp and climbed into bed. The mattress rustled softly beneath her. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the black sky, like diamonds spilled on velvet. So many stars, more than she'd ever seen in the smoke-haze skies of St. Louis. They looked close enough to touch, bright enough to guide travelers through the darkest night. In the main room, Damon lay on his bedroll near the dying fire, staring up at the ceiling beams. He'd spoken the truth when he told Ruby she was exactly what he sought. He hadn't been looking for beauty, which faded with time and meant nothing against the hard realities of frontier life. He'd been looking for courage, for honesty, for someone who knew what it meant to be marked by life and to keep walking anyway. Ruby Jane Sutton, scarred and frightened, and brave enough to travel 1,000 miles on a lie that she'd immediately confessed, was more than he'd hoped to find. He thought of the way she'd held on to him during the ride, not clinging in fear, but holding steady, adapting to the rhythm of the horse. He thought of her tears when he'd spoken of her scars, not tears of self-pity, but of recognition, as if someone had finally seen her truly. He thought of the quiet competence with which she'd moved through his kitchen, setting the table, washing up, making herself useful without being asked. She would do well here, he thought, if she stayed. If the reality of frontier life didn't drive her back to civilization and the world she knew. Outside, a coyote called, its voice rising in a yipping howl that echoed off the canyon walls. Another answered from farther away, and then another, until the night was filled with their wild song. Damon smiled in the darkness. The coyotes were welcoming her in their way, telling her she'd entered their territory, their domain, reminding her that this land belonged to creatures older and wilder than any human settlement. Tomorrow he would show her the ranch properly, teach her how to avoid rattlesnakes and where the best herbs grew for cooking, introduce her to the horses, and explain the work that filled each day from dawn until dusk. Tomorrow they would begin the slow process of learning each other, of building something that might one day be called partnership, or friendship, or perhaps even more. But tonight, they both slept under the same roof for the first time. Two strangers brought together by circumstances and accidents, by lies and desperate hopes, by the vast indifferent machinery of fate that sometimes, against all odds, put the right people in the right place at the right time. The fire burned down to embers. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and in a small adobe house at the edge of the Arizona desert, two marked souls rested, gathering strength for whatever morning would bring. Ruby woke to unfamiliar sounds. The cry of a hawk circling overhead, sharp and piercing. The rustle of wind through brush that scratched against the adobe walls. The distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the house. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Her mind still caught between sleep and waking, expecting to see the water-stained ceiling of the St. Louis boarding house. Then memory rushed back. The stagecoach, the desert, the man with kind eyes who'd called her scars marks instead of damage. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from yesterday's long ride. Morning light streamed through the small window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. She dressed quickly in her grey traveling dress, the only serviceable one she owned, and braided her hair with practiced efficiency. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found the main room empty, the fire reduced to cold ashes, and a pot of coffee sitting on the edge of the hearth, still faintly warm through the window. She spotted Damon near the corral, working with one of the horses. He moved with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime around animals, his hands gentle but firm as he ran them along the horse's flank, checking for injuries or problems. Ruby poured herself coffee from the pot, grateful for its bitter warmth, and stepped out onto the small wooden porch that fronted the house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The morning air was cool, a stark contrast to yesterday's brutal heat. The sun hadn't yet climbed high enough to turn the desert into an oven, and Ruby could see why people who lived here learned to rise early and rest during the scorching afternoon hours. The landscape stretched before her in every direction, red rock and sage and sky, beautiful in its starkness, so different from the crowded streets and brick buildings she'd known all her life. Damon looked up from his work and raised a hand in greeting. Ruby set down her coffee cup and walked toward the corral, her boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. As she approached, she could see the horse more clearly, a young bay mare with a white blaze down her face and intelligent eyes that watched Ruby with cautious interest. "Her name is Sage," Damon said, continuing his examination of the horse's legs. "She threw a shoe yesterday, and I wanted to make sure she didn't bruise the hoof. Looks good, though. I'll take her to the blacksmith in town next week." He straightened and looked at Ruby properly. "You slept well, better than I have in months," Ruby admitted. "The quiet is strange. In the city, there's always noise. Carriages, vendors shouting, factory whistles. Here it's so still, it almost feels like the world is holding its breath." "You'll get used to it," Damon said. "After a while, you'll learn to hear what the quiet is saying. The wind patterns that mean rain coming. The way birds go silent before a predator passes through. The sound of a horse limping versus walking normally. The desert talks. You just have to learn its language." He gestured toward the house. "There's bread in the tin beside the stove and butter in the cold box out back. I buried it in damp sand to keep it cool. Help yourself to breakfast. After you eat, I'll show you around the property." Ruby nodded and returned to the house. She found the bread where he'd indicated, along with a jar of honey that must have cost him dearly in this remote place. She ate standing by the window, watching Damon work with the horse, noting the patience in every movement, the calm authority that made the animal trust him. When she finished, she washed her plate and cup, then went to find the cold box he'd mentioned. Behind the house, she discovered a clever setup. A wooden box buried halfway in the ground, beneath a makeshift shade structure, packed around with damp sand that would evaporate slowly in the heat, keeping the interior cooler than the surrounding air. Inside, she found not just butter but also eggs, a small wheel of cheese and strips of salted meat. It wasn't much, but it spoke of careful planning. of a man who knew how to make the most of limited resources. When Damon finished with the horse, he found Ruby examining the small vegetable garden tucked against the east side of the house, where the cliff face provided afternoon shade. Tomato plants struggled in the harsh conditions, their leaves slightly yellowed despite regular watering. A few squash vines sprawled across the ground, and she recognized the feathery tops of carrots poking through the soil. "I'm not much of a gardener," Damon admitted, coming to stand beside her. "The soil here is more sand than earth, and the heat kills most things I try to grow. But the tomatoes usually give me enough for salsa and cooking, and the squash does all right if I water twice a day." Ruby knelt and touched the soil, letting it run through her fingers. "It needs organic matter, compost from kitchen scraps, manure from the animals, and these tomatoes are getting too much sun in the afternoon. If we built a simple shade cloth and hung it on poles, it would filter the worst of the heat." She looked up at him. "At the orphanage we had a garden. It was the only way we could afford to feed all the children. I learned how to coax vegetables from soil that didn't want to give them up." Interest flickered in Damon's eyes. "If you can improve the garden, that would be welcome. Every bit of food we can grow ourselves means less money spent at the mercantile in town. And their prices are robbery, especially for fresh vegetables." They spent the next hour walking the property. Damon showed her where the well was, demonstrating how to work the pump handle and warning her that water was precious, never to be wasted. He took her to the barn, a sturdy structure that housed 3 horses besides Sage, the buckskin gelding he'd ridden yesterday, an older mare with a swayed back that he used for pack work, and a young stallion he was training for the territorial marshal. "I break horses for the law and for local ranchers," he explained, as they stood in the barn's dim interior, breathing air that smelled of hay and horse and leather. "It brings in steady money, and I'm good at it. Most people break horses by force, by beating the spirit out of them until they submit. I do it differently. I listen to what the horse is telling me, work with their nature instead of against it. Takes longer, but the horses that come out of my training are reliable, not just broken." Ruby reached out carefully to stroke the young stallion's nose. The horse snuffed at her palm, then allowed the touch. "Like people," she said softly. "You can break them or you can teach them. One creates obedience, the other creates partnership." "Exactly," Damon said, and there was approval in his voice. They continued the tour. He showed her the chicken coop, where a dozen hens scratched and pecked at the ground, presided over by a bad-tempered rooster that eyed Ruby with deep suspicion. He pointed out the boundaries of his land, 320 acres total, a combination of homestead claim and purchased property stretching from the creek bed to the base of the red cliffs. He explained that cattle grazed on the open range beyond his fenced property, marked with his brand, a simple design that combined his initials with a symbol from his mother's people. "Do you see your mother's family?" Ruby asked as they walked along the creek, following a narrow path through the cottonwoods. The Apache, Damon's expression became more guarded. "Sometimes. There's a band that camps in the mountains to the north during summer. My mother's sister is among them. I visit when I can, bring supplies they need, trade for things I can't get in town. But it's complicated. They live between 2 worlds now, not free to roam as they once did, not fully settled either. The government wants them on reservations. They want to live as their ancestors did. The conflict creates suffering on all sides." Ruby heard the pain beneath his carefully neutral words. "And you? Where do you fit?" "Nowhere," he said simply. "Everywhere. I've learned to make peace with belonging to no single place or people. This ranch, this land, it's mine in a way that has nothing to do with deeds or papers. It's mine because I understand it, because I've given it my sweat and blood, because I'll defend it against anyone who tries to take it. That's the only kind of belonging that matters out here." They reached a bend in the creek where the water pooled into a clear basin, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Willows drooped their branches into the water, and Ruby could see small fish darting in the shadows. It was the most beautiful spot she'd seen on the property, peaceful and hidden, a secret garden in the middle of harsh desert. "I come here when I need to think," Damon said. "Or when the world gets too loud, even in all this quiet." "You're welcome to do the same. Everyone needs a place that's just theirs." They turned back toward the house, and as they walked, Damon began pointing out plants. Which ones were edible, which ones medicinal, which ones to avoid entirely. He showed her prickly pear cactus and explained how to harvest the fruit. He pointed out creosote bush and told her that tea made from its leaves could ease stomach troubles. He indicated a small grey plant with fuzzy leaves and said it was desert sage, useful for cooking and for cleansing smoke in ceremonies his mother's people performed. Ruby absorbed it all like parched ground soaking up rain. Every piece of information was a tool for survival, a way to read the landscape that had seemed so alien yesterday, but was beginning to reveal itself as a place of hidden abundance for those who knew where to look. By the time they returned to the house, the sun had climbed to its zenith, and the temperature had risen dramatically. Damon went to tend to some repairs on the barn roof, while Ruby explored the house more thoroughly, taking stock of what was there and what was needed. The cupboards held basic supplies: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, sugar, a few tins of preserved vegetables. Cooking implements hung from hooks near the fireplace: iron pots, a Dutch oven, long-handled spoons and ladles. Everything was clean but worn, used hard and cared for adequately, but without any particular attention to comfort or aesthetics. It was a bachelor's house, Ruby realized. Functional, survivable, but not a home. Not really. It lacked the small touches that made a space welcoming: curtains to soften the harsh light, rugs to warm the packed earth floor, decorative touches that served no practical purpose but fed the soul nonetheless. She found herself imagining changes, additions, improvements, not to impose her will on Damon's space, but to transform it into something that belonged to both of them, a true shared home. But first, she needed to prove her worth in practical ways. She found a broom in the corner and swept the floors thoroughly, raising clouds of dust that she swept out the door. She took inventory of the food supplies and realized they were running low on several staples. She checked the water barrel inside and found it half empty, so she made several trips to the pump, filling buckets and hauling them inside until the barrel was full again. The work was harder than she'd anticipated in the heat, and by the time she finished, her dress was soaked with sweat and her arms ached. She was catching her breath on the porch when a rider appeared on the trail from town. Ruby's first instinct was to retreat inside, to hide her scarred face from a stranger's gaze, but she forced herself to remain where she was. She'd come too far to keep hiding now. The rider was a woman, Ruby realized as the figure drew closer. She sat her horse with easy competence, wearing men's trousers and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. As she approached the house, Ruby could see she was perhaps 40 years old, with sun-weathered skin and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She reined in her horse and nodded to Ruby. "You must be the bride," the woman said without preamble. Her voice was rough, like wind over stone. "Word travels fast in small towns. I'm Margaret Sloane. My husband and I run the ranch 5 miles east. Brought you some things." She swung down from her horse with practiced ease and untied a bundle from her saddle. "Eggs from my chickens, some preserves I put up last fall, and a loaf of bread I baked this morning. Figured you'd need supplies and wouldn't have had time to get settled yet." Ruby accepted the bundle, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Sloane. That's very generous." "Margaret," the woman corrected. "Out here we don't stand on ceremony much. Life's too short and too hard for unnecessary formality." Her eyes studied Ruby's face frankly, taking in the scar without flinching or looking away. "I heard you came from St. Louis. That's a long journey. What brings a city woman to the Arizona territory?" Ruby met her gaze steadily. "A chance at a different life. And a man willing to give me that chance, even though I'm not what he ordered." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Damon's a good man. Quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but decent through and through. Some folks in town don't trust him on account of his mixed blood. But those are the same folks whose opinions aren't worth a bucket of warm spit anyway. She glanced toward the barn, where sounds of hammering indicated Damon was still working. You planning to marry him proper? Or is this some kind of trial arrangement? I don't know yet, Ruby said honestly. We only met yesterday, but I'm hoping we can build something real, given time. Time's the one thing you've got plenty of out here, Margaret said. That and space, and silence, whether you want it or not. She moved to remount her horse, then paused. There's a gathering at the church in town next Sunday, after services. Nothing fancy, just neighbors meeting to talk about forming a school district for the children. You should come. Good way to meet people, and Damon could use more connections to the community. Some of the ranchers have been pressuring him to sell his land, and the more friends he has, the harder it'll be for them to push him around. Why would they want him to sell? Ruby asked, alarm rising in her chest. Margaret's expression darkened. Because his land has the best water access in the valley, and because some men can't stand the thought of a half-breed owning prime property they think should belong to white settlers. It's ugly business, and it's been brewing for a while. You should know what you're walking into. She mounted her horse and looked down at Ruby. But don't let that scare you off. Damon can handle himself, and a good woman standing beside him will make him stronger, not weaker. Just keep your eyes open and your wits sharp. She rode off before Ruby could respond, leaving her standing on the porch with the bundle of food and a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. When Damon came in from the barn an hour later, Ruby had prepared a simple meal of eggs and bread, using Margaret's gifts. They ate at the small table, and Ruby told him about the visitor. Margaret's solid, Damon said, sopping up egg yolk with a piece of bread. Her husband Tom is too. They were among the first to settle this valley, and they don't buy into the prejudices that poison some folks' thinking. He paused, studying Ruby's face. She told you about the trouble. It wasn't a question. Ruby nodded. She said some ranchers want your land. They want the water, Damon corrected. There are 3 creeks in this valley. Mine is the most reliable, runs year-round even in drought years. Control the water, control the ranching. They've been making offers for 2 years now, each one more aggressive than the last. So far, it's just been words and veiled threats. But words have a way of turning into actions when people don't get what they want. Fear flickered through Ruby, but she pushed it down. What will you do? Same thing I've been doing. Keep my land, tend my business, and make it clear I'm not interested in selling at any price. His dark eyes met hers across the table. I won't lie to you, Ruby. Life here might get complicated. If you stay, you'll be tied to those complications. Some people in town already don't like me. They'll like you even less for choosing to be with me. You need to understand that before you make any permanent decisions, Ruby thought of the whispers that had followed her in St. Louis after the fire, the pitying looks, the turned backs, the slow erosion of her place in a community that had once accepted her. She'd survived that. She could survive this. I'm not afraid of complications, she said, and I'm not afraid of people who judge without knowing. I've dealt with both before. Something like respect flickered in Damon's expression. I believe you have. That night, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, Ruby sat on the porch steps while Damon tended the horses one final time before bed. The stars were emerging overhead, bright and numberless, and the air had cooled to something almost pleasant. She heard him approach, his footsteps quiet on the hard ground, and felt him settle onto the step beside her. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. I've been thinking, he said after a long silence, about arrangements, about how this should work between us. Ruby's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice calm. All right. I asked for a wife through that agency because I wanted partnership, not just someone to cook and clean. I want someone who'll work beside me, who'll have a say in decisions about the ranch, who'll be a true partner in building this life. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But partnership takes time to build. Trust has to be earned on both sides. So here's what I propose. We give ourselves 6 months. You'll have the bedroom and I'll sleep out here. I'll pay you fair wages for your work around the ranch, same as I'd pay any hired hand. At the end of 6 months, we'll both decide if we want to make this permanent. If you want to leave, I'll give you money for passage back east and a good reference. If you want to stay, we'll marry proper and build this life together. Does that seem fair?" Relief and something else, something almost like disappointment, flooded through Ruby. The arrangement was sensible, practical, and more generous than she had any right to expect. But part of her had hoped for something more immediate, some declaration that they were committed to each other from this moment forward. She pushed the foolish thought aside. Damon was right. Trust had to be earned. "That's more than fair," she said. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," he said with a slight smile. "You haven't experienced summer in the desert. You might be begging for that passage east by August." Ruby smiled despite herself. "I'm tougher than I look, I know," Damon said quietly. "I knew that the moment you stepped off that stage and told me the truth when you could have kept lying. That took more courage than most people have." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars brightened overhead and the desert night settled around them like a blanket. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other, their voices rising and falling in wild harmony. An owl hooted from the cottonwoods by the creek. The wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and growing things. Ruby thought about the 6 months ahead, about the work and challenges and uncertainties they would bring. But underneath the anxiety was something else, something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope, not the desperate. Grasping hope that had driven her to take Evangeline's place, but a quieter, steadier kind. The hope that came from knowing she'd been given a genuine chance, an honest opportunity to prove herself and build something real. "I won't let you down," she said softly. Damon looked at her, his face half in shadow, half in starlight. "I know," he said, "and I'll do my best not to let you down either. That's all we can promise each other right now. Our best efforts and honest hearts." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't romance. But it was true, and truth, Ruby was learning, was worth more than pretty words. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Good night, Damon. Good night, Ruby." She went inside to the small bedroom that was hers for now, leaving him on the porch under the vast desert sky. As she lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home, Ruby felt the last remnants of her old life falling away like dead skin. Whatever came next, whoever she became in this hard, beautiful place, it would be something she chose. Not something forced upon her by circumstance or other people's judgments, but a life she built with her own scarred hands. One day at a time, and that, she thought, as sleep began to claim her, was worth every mile she'd traveled to get here. The first 2 weeks passed in a blur of relentless work and discovery. Ruby learned quickly that frontier life demanded strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her hands, already calloused from years of laundry work, developed new rough patches from hauling water, splitting kindling, and working in the garden under the merciless sun. Her back ached from bending over vegetable rows. Her shoulders burned from carrying heavy buckets, and her legs trembled at the end of each day. But she didn't complain. She'd promised honest work, and she intended to deliver. She rose before dawn each morning, starting the fire and preparing coffee before Damon woke. She quickly learned his preferences. Coffee strong enough to strip paint, eggs cooked until the yolks were just barely set, bread toasted over the open flame until it had dark, crispy edges. He never asked for these things, but she noticed what he reached for first, what he finished completely, what he left on his plate. Small observations that helped her understand this quiet man who spoke more through actions than words. In return, Damon taught her the skills she'd need to survive in the territory. He showed her how to recognize the distinctive rattle of a sidewinder before seeing it, how to check her boots each morning for scorpions that might have crawled inside during the night, how to read the sky for weather changes that could turn deadly in minutes. He taught her to shoot, spending patient hours behind the barn while she practiced with his spare rifle until she could hit a tin can at 30 yards more often than not. "You don't have to be a sharpshooter," he'd said, watching her reload with fumbling fingers. "You just have to be good enough to make a threat think twice." Out here, that's often enough. The garden became Ruby's domain. She mixed manure from the horses with kitchen scraps and worked the rich compost into the sandy soil, transforming it inch by inch into something that could actually nurture life. She built the shade structure she'd envisioned, using old canvas Damon had stored in the barn and rough-cut poles she dragged from the creek bed. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. Within days, the tomato plants perked up, their leaves darkening to a healthier green. The squash vines spread more vigorously. She planted seeds she'd brought from St. Louis, precious packets of herbs she'd saved from her own meager wages, basil, oregano, parsley. They might not survive the desert heat, but she had to try. On the third Sunday after her arrival, Damon asked if she wanted to attend the community gathering Margaret had mentioned. Ruby's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of facing a crowd of strangers, all of them staring at her scar and judging her presence beside Damon, made her stomach clench with familiar dread. But she'd promised herself no more hiding. So she nodded and put on her better dress, the one she'd been saving, a simple blue cotton that had once been her Sunday best before the fire. The ride into Copper Ridge took an hour. Ruby sat behind Damon on the buckskin gelding, her arms around his waist, growing more comfortable with the rhythm of horseback travel. As they approached the town, she could see wagons and horses gathered near a white-clappered church that looked almost defiant in its New England propriety. A piece of Eastern civilization dropped incongruously into the raw desert landscape. People were milling about outside, clusters of families in their Sunday clothes. Children ran between the adults, their laughter high and bright. Ruby felt every eye turned toward them as they approached. She forced herself to keep her chin up, to meet those stares with as much dignity as she could muster. Damon helped her down from the horse, his hand steady on her elbow. "Stay close," he murmured. "Some of these folks are friendly. Some aren't. You'll figure out which is which soon enough." Margaret Sloane materialized from the crowd, her weathered face breaking into a welcoming smile. "You came. Good. Ruby, this is my husband Tom." She gestured to a solid man with kind eyes and a magnificent beard. "Tom, this is Damon's bride-to-be, Ruby Sutton." Tom Sloane extended his hand and Ruby shook it, grateful when he didn't flinch at the sight of her scar. "Welcome to the valley, Miss Sutton. Any friend of Damon's is welcome at our table any time." Other introductions followed. The circuit preacher, Reverend Blackwell, a thin man with intense eyes who spoke in a booming voice that seemed too large for his frame. The school teacher, Miss Judith Carver, a spinster of perhaps 35 who looked Ruby up and down with sharp intelligence before offering a genuine smile. The town doctor, Samuel Worth, who asked after her health with professional courtesy. The general store owner, Mr. Horace Pike, who was polite but distant, his eyes sliding away from both Ruby and Damon as if not quite sure what to make of them. Not everyone was welcoming. Ruby noticed a cluster of men standing apart from the main gathering, their eyes hard as they watched Damon. One of them, a heavy-set man with a face like weathered leather and cruel eyes, stared at Ruby with an expression that made her skin crawl. She moved closer to Damon instinctively. "That's Clayton Voss," Damon said quietly. "He owns the biggest ranch in the valley. He's the one who wants my land." Before Ruby could respond, Clayton Voss himself approached, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. Two other men flanked him, clearly hired hands rather than ranchers themselves. Voss stopped a few feet away, his eyes traveling over Damon with open contempt before settling on Ruby. "So it's true," Voss said, his voice carrying deliberately so others could hear. "The half-breed bought himself a woman. Didn't think any decent female would willingly tie herself to your kind, Warbear. Had to order one from back east like a Sears catalog purchase." Ruby felt Damon tense beside her, but his voice remained calm. "My personal business is none of your concern, Voss. We came for the school meeting, not for trouble." "School meeting," Voss laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You planning to send your half-breed children there? Assuming you can make any with that scarred-up thing you brought home?" His eyes fixed on Ruby's face, lingering on the burn with deliberate cruelty. though I suppose beggars can't be choosers. A damaged woman for a savage man. Seems about right. The words hit Ruby like physical blows, each one finding the soft places where her insecurities lived. But before she could respond, before Damon could react, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Clayton." Tom Sloan stepped forward, his bulk impressive despite his advancing years. "You came to church this morning. Did you somehow miss the sermon about treating your neighbors with Christian charity? Or does that only apply to neighbors you consider worthy?" Voss's face darkened. "Stay out of this, Sloan. This doesn't concern you. When you insult guests in our community, it concerns all of us," Margaret added, moving to stand beside her husband. Others began to drift closer, forming a loose circle. The school teacher, Miss Carver, positioned herself deliberately beside Ruby. Even Reverend Blackwell approached, his expression grave. "Mr. Voss," the preacher said quietly, "you are welcome at our gatherings, but you will mind your tongue or find yourself unwelcome in the future. These meetings are for building community, not tearing it down." For a moment, tension hung thick in the air. Then Voss spat in the dirt at Damon's feet and turned away, his men following. "Enjoy your mongrel bride, Warbear, but don't get too comfortable on that land of yours. Things have a way of changing out here." The threat was unmistakable. Ruby watched Voss walk away, her heart pounding, anger and fear warring in her chest. She felt Damon's hand find hers, his fingers warm and steady. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I hoped it wouldn't be this bad." Ruby squeezed his hand. "I've been called worse by better people. He doesn't scare me." It was half true. Voss did frighten her, but not enough to make her run. "Not anymore," the meeting proceeded, though the earlier confrontation had cast a shadow over the proceedings. They discussed forming a proper school district, pooling resources to build a schoolhouse and hire a full-time teacher. Miss Carver currently taught in a corner of the general store, but the arrangement was inadequate for the growing number of children in the valley. Families pledged money, labor, and materials. When it came their turn, Damon offered lumber from his land and 3 days of labor. Ruby surprised herself by offering to help with teaching if needed, her experience at the orphanage school suddenly seeming relevant. After the meeting, several women approached Ruby. Some were genuinely friendly, curious about her background, and interested in getting to know her. Others were simply curious, their questions probing and their glances lingering on her scar. Ruby answered politely, revealing enough to satisfy curiosity without exposing the rawest parts of her past. She mentioned the orphanage, the fire, the decision to come west for a fresh start. She did not mention Evangeline or the deception that had brought her here. That was between her and Damon, no one else's business. Miss Carver pulled her aside before they left. "I meant what I said about teaching help. The younger children need someone patient to work with them on basic letters and numbers. If you're willing, I'd welcome the assistance. I can't pay much, but it would be something I'd like that," Ruby said, and realized she meant it. The thought of working with children again, of having purpose beyond the endless labor of ranch work, appealed to something deep inside her. "When would you want me to start?" "Next week, if you can manage it. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, morning hours only. That would give you afternoons for your own work." They settled the details, and Ruby felt a small spark of excitement. This was how she'd build a place for herself here, not just as Damon's woman, but as a member of the community in her own right. The ride home was quiet. Damon seemed lost in thought, his body tense despite his relaxed posture. Ruby finally broke the silence. "You're worried about what Voss said, about things changing. Voss doesn't make empty threats," Damon said. "He's been trying to force me out for 2 years. Offers that insulted intelligence, then offers backed by veiled warnings, then open hostility. Today was him making his position public. It means he's planning something. What can he do? The land is yours legally. He can't just take it. There are ways around legality out here," Damon said grimly. "Cattle can be rustled and blamed on me. Fences can be cut. Water can be poisoned. Buildings can catch fire. And if the territorial marshal gets called in to investigate, well, a half-breed's word doesn't carry much weight against that of a prominent white rancher. Fear coiled in Ruby's stomach, but with it came something else, determination. Then we'll be careful. We'll watch for trouble, and we won't let him drive us away. Damon glanced back at her, and she saw something like wonder in his expression. You keep saying we, like you've already decided you're staying, haven't you noticed? Ruby said softly. I stopped thinking about leaving a week ago. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with possibility and shared purpose. When they reached the ranch, Damon helped her down from the horse, and his hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and Ruby felt her breath catch. There was something in his gaze she hadn't seen before, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Thank you, he said quietly, for standing with me today, for not letting Voss's words make you ashamed to be seen with me. Why would I be ashamed? Ruby asked. You're the best man I've ever known. And if people are too blind to see that because of your blood, that's their failing, not yours. Damon's hand came up to cup her scarred cheek, his thumb tracing the ridged skin with infinite gentleness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. And you're the bravest woman I've ever met. Anyone who can't see past this, he touched the scar, to the strength beneath isn't worth your time. They stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with things unspoken. Then Damon stepped back, breaking the spell. I should tend the horses. You must be tired. Ruby was tired, but she didn't want to go inside, didn't want this moment to end. I'll help. They worked together in the barn, the familiar task soothing after the tensions of the day. As Ruby forked fresh hay into the stalls, she thought about what had happened in town, the hostility she'd expected, the kindness she hadn't, the way some people had looked through her and Damon as if they didn't exist, while others had deliberately chosen to stand beside them. The world, she was learning, wasn't divided simply into good people and bad. It was more complicated than that, more nuanced. That night, after a simple supper, Ruby sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible shades of orange and purple. Damon emerged from the house carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed her one and settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I've been thinking, he said, about the teaching position Miss Carver offered. You should take it. I plan to, Ruby said. If you don't mind me being away from the ranch 3 mornings a week. Mind, Ruby, you're not my prisoner here. You're free to do as you please. Besides, it's good for you to have connections in town, to build your own place in the community. And the money, small as it is, will be yours to keep or spend as you see fit. I'd rather put it toward the ranch, Ruby said. Toward our future, if we decide there is one. Damon was quiet for a moment. You really think there might be? After today, after seeing what you'd be facing if you stay, Ruby turned to look at him directly. Today didn't change anything. I already knew there'd be people who'd judge us, who'd make trouble. That's no different than what I faced back in St. Louis. At least here, I'm facing it alongside someone who understands. Someone who doesn't see me as damaged goods or a charity case. She paused. Unless you're having second thoughts about me staying. No, Damon said quickly, and there was fervor in his voice she hadn't heard before. No second thoughts. If anything, today made me more certain. When you stood there beside me, not flinching from Voss's words, not hiding your face or apologizing for existing, just standing tall and strong and refusing to be ashamed. Ruby, do you know how rare that is? How precious? His words wrapped around Ruby's heart like warm hands. She set down her coffee cup and reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. I'm not going anywhere, Damon. Not in 6 months, not ever, unless you send me away. I know we said we'd wait, we'd take time to decide. But I've already decided. This is home now. You're home. Damon's fingers tightened on hers. The 6 months was to protect you, to give you an escape if you needed it. I didn't want you to feel trapped. I don't feel trapped. I feel found." Ruby brought his hand to her scarred cheek, pressing his palm against the damaged skin. "I spent 3 years believing I was too broken for anyone to want. You looked at me and saw something worth keeping. How could I not stay?" They sat there as darkness fell completely, hands clasped, shoulders touching, two people who'd been cast aside by the world, finding unexpected sanctuary in each other. The coyotes began their nightly chorus, and an owl called from the cottonwoods. The desert breathed around them, alive and wild, and indifferent to human troubles. "We should go inside," Damon said eventually, though he made no move to stand. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day. I need to ride out to check the herd in the north pasture, and you'll want to work in the garden before it gets too hot." 5 more minutes, Ruby said softly. "I like it out here. It feels like the whole world is ours, like nothing bad can touch us." 5 more minutes, Damon agreed, and they sat together under the emerging stars, stealing a moment of peace before the challenges of tomorrow came knocking. Later, lying in her bed with the window open to catch any stray breeze, Ruby thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. If someone had told her 3 months ago that she'd find happiness in the Arizona desert, beside a man who was everything St. Louis society would consider unsuitable, she would have laughed at the absurdity. But here she was, happier than she'd been in years, maybe happier than she'd ever been. Not because life was easy, it wasn't, but because it was real. Because she was choosing it, not having it thrust upon her by circumstance or desperation. She touched her scarred cheek, remembering Damon's gentle fingers tracing the ridged skin. No one had touched her scar with tenderness before. Most people avoided it, averted their eyes, pretended it wasn't there. But Damon had touched it as if it were simply part of her, no more remarkable than the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. He touched it and called her brave. Through the wall she could hear the soft sounds of Damon preparing his bedroll by the fireplace. In 6 months they'd planned to decide about marriage. But Ruby had already decided. Now she just had to wait for Damon to realize she wasn't going to change her mind. That this scarred, stubborn, determined woman who'd arrived under false pretenses was exactly where she belonged, and no amount of time or trouble was going to convince her otherwise. The thought made her smile in the darkness. She'd come west as a lie and found truth. She'd come expecting rejection and found acceptance. She'd come alone and found partnership. Whatever came next, whether trouble from Clayton Voss, or challenges from the unforgiving land, or simple day-to-day struggles of frontier life, she would face it all with Damon beside her. And that, Ruby thought as sleep finally claimed her, was worth more than all the beauty or respectability or conventional happiness the world had to offer. 3 weeks into her teaching position, Ruby discovered she had a talent for reaching the children others had given up on. There was Tommy Wright, 8 years old and convinced he was too stupid to learn his letters because his father told him so daily. Ruby spent patient hours with him, using sticks in the dirt to form shapes, letting him trace letters with his fingers before ever asking him to write. Within 2 weeks he was reading simple words, his face glowing with an accomplishment no one had believed possible. Then there was Maria Gonzalez, the daughter of a Mexican ranch hand, who sat silent in the back corner because the other children mocked her accent. Ruby made it a point to learn Spanish phrases from Maria's mother, incorporating them into lessons, showing the class that knowing 2 languages was a gift, not a deficit. Slowly, Maria began to participate, her voice growing stronger each day. The children never asked about Ruby's scar. To them, it was simply part of who she was, no more remarkable than Miss Carver's spectacles or the freckles that covered Tommy Wright's nose. Their acceptance, so natural and unforced, healed something in Ruby she hadn't known was still bleeding. But while her days in town brought satisfaction, trouble was brewing at the ranch. It started small. Fence posts pulled up during the night, forcing Damon to spend hours repairing them. A section of the irrigation ditch to the garden mysteriously blocked with rocks, nearly killing her plants before she discovered it. 2 chickens missing from the coop, no sign of predator damage, just gone. Damon said nothing, but Ruby saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon when he worked outside. He'd taken to keeping his rifle within arm's reach at all times. At night, she'd wake to find him on the porch, watching the darkness, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Then came the morning Ruby rode into town for her teaching day and found the word "savage" painted across the general store wall in crude red letters. Below it, "Go back to the reservation where you belong." Everyone knew it was meant for Damon, even though he rarely came to town. Mr. Pike was scrubbing at the paint, his face red with either embarrassment or anger. "Hard to tell which. I'm sorry you have to see this. Miss Sutton," he said when Ruby approached. "Happened sometime in the night. I've got no use for this kind of ugliness in my town." Ruby appreciated the sentiment, but she noticed he didn't say "our town," didn't include Damon in that collective ownership. Still, the fact that he was removing the words rather than leaving them spoke to some decency. She went on to the school, but the ugly message haunted her throughout the morning. That afternoon, riding home alone because Damon was checking the North Range, Ruby spotted smoke on the horizon, thin and dark, coming from the direction of the ranch. Her heart seized in her chest. She kicked her horse into a gallop, racing across the desert trail with reckless speed, branches whipping at her face and arms. The smoke grew thicker as she approached, and she could smell it now, acrid and wrong. Not the house, thank God. The barn was untouched. But the small equipment shed, where Damon stored tools and saddle repairs, was fully engulfed, flames licking at the dry wood with hungry enthusiasm. Ruby leaped from her horse and ran for the well, grabbing buckets, her mind racing. The shed was lost, but if the flames spread to the dried grass, the whole ranch could go up. She hauled water and threw it on the grass surrounding the shed, creating a wet barrier. Again and again, her arms screaming with effort, her dress soaked with water and sweat. The heat was tremendous, forcing her to work at a distance, but she kept going, kept fighting, refusing to let the fire spread. She didn't know how long she worked, time becoming meaningless in the face of urgency and fear. Then Damon was there, appearing as if conjured from smoke, taking the buckets from her hands. "Get back," he ordered, but she didn't listen, grabbing more water, working beside him. Together, they beat back the flames' attempt to spread, containing the damage to the shed alone. By the time the structure collapsed into smoldering ruins, both of them were blackened with soot and exhausted beyond measure. Ruby sank to the ground, her legs refusing to hold her any longer. Damon knelt beside her, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. "This wasn't an accident," he said flatly. "This was set—" "I know," Ruby whispered. Her hands were blistered from the bucket handles, her throat raw from smoke. Voss, or someone he paid. Same thing. Damon's jaw clenched. "He's escalating, making it clear he won't stop." Fear turned to anger in Ruby's chest, hot and fierce. "So what do we do? Just let him destroy everything you've built? Let him drive us away?" "I don't know," Damon admitted, and the defeat in his voice was more frightening than anything else. "I can't prove it was him. The territorial marshal is 3 days' ride away, and even if he came, what would he do? There are no witnesses, no evidence. Just my word against Voss's, and we both know whose word carries more weight." Ruby grabbed his soot-stained hand. "Then we make ourselves impossible to ignore. We document everything. Every incident, every threat, every piece of damaged property. We get witnesses when we can. We make friends with everyone who'll stand with us. We fight this the way you taught me to fight rattlesnakes, by making ourselves too much trouble to be worth the effort." A ghost of a smile crossed Damon's face. "You really won't back down, will you?" "Not while I'm breathing," Ruby said fiercely. "This is our home, ours, and I'll be damned if I'll let Clayton Voss or anyone else take it from us." That evening, after they'd cleaned up and tended their burns, Ruby made a decision. She went to the small trunk where she kept her few possessions and pulled out the letter, Evangeline's letter, the one that had brought her here under false pretenses. She'd kept it hidden, a shameful reminder of the deception that had started everything. But secrets had a way of becoming weapons in the hands of enemies. Better to disarm them first. She found Damon on the porch, staring at the ruins of the shed, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Ruby sat beside him and held out the letter. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said from the beginning." He took the letter, unfolded it, and began to read. Ruby watched his face, but his expression revealed nothing. When he finished, he refolded it carefully and handed it back. "So you weren't just replacing someone who changed her mind. You took her identity entirely?" "Yes," Ruby admitted, shame burning in her chest. "I was desperate, and I told myself it was just a small lie that I'd explain once I got here. But the truth is, I was terrified you'd send me back if you knew. So I kept lying, even after you showed me kindness I didn't deserve." Damon was quiet for a long moment. "Then why tell me now? Because Voss is looking for leverage, for any way to hurt us. If he discovers this, if he can use it to claim our arrangement is fraudulent, or that I'm some kind of criminal, he will. I won't let him blindside us with my own secrets." She took a shaky breath. "If you want me to leave now, I'll understand. You asked for honesty between us, and I gave you lies." "You gave me truth," Damon corrected quietly. "Maybe not at first, but you told me the truth within minutes of meeting me. You could have kept lying, could have let me believe you were this Evangeline person. But you didn't. You confessed immediately, even knowing I might refuse you." He looked at her directly. "That took more courage than maintaining the lie would have. And everything since then has been honest, hasn't it?" "Yes," Ruby whispered. "Everything since I stepped off that stage has been the truth." "Then that's what matters." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "We've all done things we're not proud of when we were desperate. I'm not going to judge you for survival, and I'm not going to let Voss use this against us. As far as anyone knows, you came here as Ruby Jane Sutton, responding to my request for a bride. Which is true, in the ways that count." Relief flooded through Ruby so powerfully she felt dizzy. She'd expected anger, rejection, a rekindling of all the doubts that had marked their first meeting. Instead, she'd found understanding, forgiveness, the kind of grace she'd stopped believing existed in the world. "Thank you," she managed to say, around the tightness in her throat. "Don't thank me for treating you like a human being who made a mistake," Damon said. "That's just basic decency." He squeezed her hand. "But I am glad you told me. No more secrets between us. Whatever comes, we face it together with full knowledge." "Agreed." "Agreed," Ruby said. They sat together as night fell, hands clasped, watching the last smoke rise from the ruins of the shed. The loss was significant. Tools and equipment that would be expensive to replace, but they were alive and unhurt and still standing. That had to count for something. The next morning, Tom Sloan arrived at dawn with his 2 sons and a wagon full of lumber. "Heard about your shed," he said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "Figured you could use some help rebuilding." "How did you hear?" Damon asked, surprised. "It only happened yesterday. News travels," Tom said gruffly. "And maybe I've been keeping an ear out for trouble headed your way. Voss has been drinking at the saloon, talking big about how half-breeds don't have staying power, how it's only a matter of time before you fold." He spat in the dirt. "Made me mad enough to want to prove him wrong. So here we are. Where do you want this lumber?" By noon, 5 more neighbors had arrived, some bringing materials, others just bringing labor and willing hands. Not everyone, the town remained divided, but enough. Enough to raise a new shed in 2 days. Enough to send a message that Damon Warbear had friends, had support, had people who wouldn't stand by while he was driven out. Ruby cooked for the work crew, stretching their supplies to feed hungry men who worked through the blazing heat. She made vast pots of beans and cornbread, brewed endless coffee, and listened to the conversations that flowed as men worked. They talked about cattle prices and water rights, about the territorial government and rumors of Arizona becoming a state someday. They talked about their families, their struggles, their hopes, and they treated Damon as one of them, not as an outsider or a curiosity, but as a fellow rancher facing the same challenges they all faced. On the second day, as the new shed took shape, Margaret Sloan arrived with 3 other ranch wives. They'd brought food and supplies, but more than that, they'd brought something Ruby hadn't expected: acceptance. They sat with her on the porch, sipping water and talking about gardens and children and the 100 small challenges of frontier life. They asked her advice about teaching their children to read, complimented her garden's remarkable recovery, and invited her to a quilting circle that met monthly at different homes. "We'd be pleased if you'd join us," said Mrs. Carson, a weathered woman with kind eyes. "We're always looking for skilled hands, and Margaret says you're clever with the needle." "I'd like that very much," Ruby said, and realized she meant it. These women were offering her something precious, a place among them, a recognition that she belonged not just as Damon's woman, but as herself. As Ruby, with her own skills and worth, as the work crew packed up on the second evening, the new shed standing sturdy and complete, Tom Sloane pulled Damon aside. Ruby watched from the house as the two men talked, their expressions serious. When they finished, Tom mounted his horse and rode away, and Damon returned to the house with a thoughtful look on his face. "What did he say?" Ruby asked. "He's been asking around quietly about Voss's finances. Apparently the man is overextended, borrowed heavily to expand his herd, and the loans are coming due. He needs more land to support the cattle he's already bought. Needs it desperately. That's why he's pushing so hard now. He's not just being cruel for sport, he's fighting for his own survival." Damon sat heavily at the table, which makes him more dangerous. "A desperate man will do things a comfortable one wouldn't consider. So what do we do?" Ruby asked. "We stay vigilant. We document everything, like you said. And we pray that Voss's creditors come calling before he does something we can't recover from." Damon rubbed his face wearily. Tom also said some of the other ranchers are getting worried. They don't like Voss's methods, don't like the precedent of driving people out through intimidation. If it can happen to me, it can happen to any of them. So there's talk of forming a ranchers' association, an official organization that could stand against this kind of bullying. That's good, isn't it? Ruby said hopefully, if it happens. Talk is easy. Action is harder. But maybe, just maybe, Voss has overplayed his hand. Maybe he's made himself the problem instead of me. That night, Ruby lay awake long after Damon's breathing had deepened into sleep in the next room. She thought about the past month, about how much had changed since she'd stepped off that stagecoach. She'd come here as a lie and been met with truth. She'd come expecting to work as a servant and found herself treated as a partner. She'd come believing she was damaged beyond anyone's ability to love, and discovered a man who saw her scars as proof of strength rather than evidence of ruin. But she'd also learned that nothing worth having came easy. This life she was building with Damon required constant vigilance, endless work, and the courage to face down people who wanted to destroy what they'd made. It required standing firm when every instinct screamed to run, required believing in a future that was far from guaranteed. Through the window, Ruby could see stars scattered across the black sky, like seeds waiting to grow into something beautiful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Voss wouldn't stop just because one shed had been rebuilt or because Damon had shown he had friends. The threat remained, lurking like a rattlesnake under a rock, waiting for the right moment to strike. But tomorrow would also bring morning light streaming through the kitchen window, coffee shared on the porch, the simple satisfaction of work well done. It would bring the sound of Damon's voice, teaching her something new about the desert, the sight of her garden thriving against all odds, the knowledge that she'd found a place where she belonged. Ruby touched her scarred cheek, feeling the ridged skin that had once been her shame and was now simply part of her story. A story that was still being written, one day at a time, one choice at a time. And if that story led to conflict with men like Clayton Voss, so be it. She'd survived fire before. She could survive whatever came next. Outside, a coyote called, its voice rising in wild song. Ruby smiled in the darkness and finally let sleep claim her, dreaming of a future that was uncertain but unmistakably hers. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in early November, when the desert air had finally surrendered its brutal heat and taken on the crispness of approaching winter. Ruby was in the garden, harvesting the last of the squash, when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast, too fast for a casual visit. She straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and saw a rider racing toward the ranch with the kind of urgency that meant trouble. It was one of Tom Sloane's sons, barely 16, his face flushed and his horse lathered from hard riding. He pulled up in a cloud of dust, gasping for breath. "Miss Ruby, you need to come quick. There's been an accident at our place. Pa was moving cattle near the gorge and something spooked them. He got trampled, broke his leg bad and maybe some ribs. Ma sent me for the doctor, but he's gone to the mining camps and won't be back for 2 days. She said you worked at an orphanage, said maybe you'd know something about tending injuries." Ruby's mind raced. Her medical knowledge was rudimentary. At best, learned from necessity when children at the orphanage fell ill or injured themselves. But 2 days without proper care could mean infection, could mean Tom Sloane losing his leg, or worse. "Where's Damon?" she asked, already moving toward the house. "Out checking the fence line on the eastern boundary. Ma said there wasn't time. To find him, said I should come straight to you." Ruby made a decision. She ran inside, grabbing the small medical kit Damon kept in the cupboard. Basic supplies of bandages and whiskey and needle and thread. She added clean cloths, a sharp knife, and the bottle of laudanum the doctor had left when Damon cut his hand last month. Her mind catalogued everything she knew about broken bones, which wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. "Take me there," she told the boy. "Fast as we can safely go." The ride to the Sloane Ranch took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Ruby's mind kept racing through possibilities, through remembered fragments of the old nurse at the orphanage, setting a child's broken arm, through warnings about bone splinters and blood loss and shock. When they arrived, she found Margaret, Sloane white-faced and struggling to keep her composure while Tom lay on the parlor floor, his leg bent at an unnatural angle and his face grey with pain. "Thank God," Margaret breathed when Ruby rushed in. "I didn't know what else to do. I can birth a calf and stitch up cuts, but this, I've never dealt with anything like this." Ruby knelt beside Tom, forcing her hands to steadiness despite the fear coursing through her. His leg was definitely broken, the bone visible through torn skin, an open fracture that could kill him if infection set in. His breathing was shallow and his eyes unfocused, shock already taking hold. She had to work fast. "I need boiling water, all the clean cloth you have, and the strongest liquor in the house," Ruby said, her voice coming out calmer than she felt. "And I need something straight and sturdy for a splint. Pieces of wood, anything that won't flex." Margaret moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies while her daughters hovered anxiously in the doorway. Ruby cut away Tom's trouser leg, exposing the full extent of the injury. Worse than she'd feared, the bone had pierced the skin and dirt had gotten into the wound. If she didn't clean it thoroughly, infection was almost guaranteed. She poured whiskey over the wound and Tom screamed, his body arcing with pain before he slumped back, mercifully unconscious. Working quickly, Ruby cleaned away dirt and debris, her stomach churning but her hands steady. She'd seen worse at the orphanage, had held down sobbing children while the nurse worked, had learned by watching and listening even when she'd wanted to look away. The bone needed to be set, aligned properly before she could splint it. Ruby had watched this done once, had seen the nurse grip a child's broken arm and pull, using force and leverage to get the bones back into position. She looked at Margaret. "I need you to hold his shoulders down. When I pull on his leg, he might wake, and he'll fight. You have to keep him still." Margaret's face was pale but determined. "Tell me what to do." Ruby gripped Tom's foot and pulled slowly but firmly, feeling for the moment when the bones would align. Tom's eyes flew open, and he screamed again, a sound of pure agony that would haunt Ruby's dreams for years. But she held on, adjusting the angle, feeling more than seeing when the bones finally slid into position. She quickly packed clean cloth around the wound and bound it tight, then secured the makeshift splints on either side of his leg, wrapping them with strips torn from bedsheets. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking, and sweat soaked her dress despite the cool morning air. Tom had mercifully passed out again, his breathing ragged but more regular than before. Ruby sat back on her heels, suddenly dizzy. He needs real medical care as soon as the doctor returns. Watch for fever, for red streaks spreading from the wound. Change the bandages twice a day and clean the wound with whiskey each time. If he develops a high fever or if the leg starts to smell bad, you'll need to send for the doctor immediately, wherever he is. Margaret was crying, tears streaming down her weathered face. You saved his life. I know you did. If that bone had stayed exposed, if infection had set in, he'd have died or lost the leg for certain. She gripped Ruby's blood-stained hands. I'll never forget this. Never. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, you just ask. Ruby stayed through the afternoon, monitoring Tom's condition, helping Margaret keep him comfortable and watching for signs of complications. By evening, his colour had improved slightly, and he was resting more peacefully, the laudanum keeping the worst of the pain at bay. Only when she was satisfied that the immediate crisis had passed did Ruby allow Margaret's son to ride her back home. She arrived to find Damon pacing the porch, his face tight with worry that melted into relief when he saw her. Tom's son found me an hour ago, told me what happened. Are you all right? Ruby slid down from the horse, her legs barely supporting her weight. The adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency had drained away, leaving her hollow and shaking. I'm fine. Tom will be too, I think. His leg is set and splinted. If infection doesn't take hold, he'll recover. Damon caught her as her knees buckled, lifting her easily and carrying her into the house. He set her gently in the rocking chair and brought her water, which she drank in gulping swallows. Only then did she realize her hands and dress were still stained with Tom's blood, that she probably looked like she'd walked through a battlefield. You should clean up, Damon said softly. I'll heat water for washing. But Ruby couldn't move yet, couldn't do anything but sit there as the reality of what she'd done crashed over her. She'd set a broken bone. She'd possibly saved a man's life using nothing but half-remembered lessons and desperate improvisation. She'd done something she'd never imagined herself capable of, had reached into herself and found strength she hadn't known existed. I was terrified, she whispered. The whole time, I was so afraid I'd make it worse, that I'd hurt him more, that he'd die because I didn't know what I was doing. Damon knelt beside the chair, taking her trembling hands in his. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, Ruby. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. You saved Tom's life today. The Sloanes won't forget that. The whole valley won't forget it. Over the next few days, visitors came in a steady stream. Ranchers and their wives, people Ruby had, met briefly at church or in passing at the general store, all stopping by to thank her, to express their gratitude and admiration. Word of what she'd done had spread through the valley like wildfire, and with it, something shifted in how people looked at her, not with pity for her scar or curiosity about the strange woman who'd come west to marry a half-breed, but with respect, with recognition of her worth that had nothing to do with beauty or propriety or any of the arbitrary measures by which society typically judged women. Even more surprisingly, Tom's injury seemed to shift something in how the community viewed Damon as well. The ranchers who came to thank Ruby stayed to talk with him about water rights and grazing patterns, about the proposed Ranchers Association and how to protect all of them from men like Clayton Voss. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls of isolation that had surrounded Damon began to crumble. 10 days after the accident, Tom Sloane himself appeared at their door, walking with crutches but walking nonetheless. His face was still gaunt from pain and recovery, but his eyes were clear and determined. "I came to say thank you properly," he said, settling carefully onto the porch bench Damon offered. "And to tell you both something important." He pulled papers from his coat pocket. "I've been talking to the other ranchers. About Voss, about the association we discussed, about protecting ourselves from bullies who think they can drive us out through intimidation." He spread the papers on his knee. "We're forming it officially. The Copper Ridge Cattlemen's Association. Bylaws, elected officers, the whole thing. We'll stand together against anyone who threatens our members, pool resources to fight legal battles if necessary, and present a united front to the territorial government." "That's good," Damon said carefully. "The Valley needs that kind of organization. We want you as a founding member," Tom said directly. "Not as some token to prove we're not prejudiced, but because you're a good rancher, because you know this land better than most of us, and because Ruby here proved that the War Bear Ranch stands for something worth protecting." He looked between them. "What do you say?" Ruby saw emotion flicker across Damon's face, quickly controlled, but unmistakable. This was what he'd wanted for years. Acceptance not as a curiosity or an outsider barely tolerated, but as an equal, as someone who belonged. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. Tom nodded, satisfied. "First meeting is next week. We'll be electing officers and deciding on our response to Voss. He's gotten wind of what we're doing, and he's not happy. Made some threats about pulling his membership, but the man's so overextended financially that his threats are hollow. Most of us think he'll be forced to sell his own ranch within the year, pay off his creditors." After Tom left, Ruby and Damon stood together on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. The air smelled of sage and coming rain, the first autumn storm building on the distant peaks. "Things are changing," Damon said softly. "I never thought I'd see it, but they're actually changing." "You earned it," Ruby said. "You were here, working this land, being a good neighbor long before I arrived. I just gave people a reason to look past their prejudices and see what was always there." Damon turned to face her, his expression intense in the fading light. "You did more than that. You changed everything. Before you came, I was surviving, getting by, accepting isolation as the price of staying on land I loved. But you made me believe that more was possible, that I could have not just land and work but community, partnership, a real life." He reached out, cupping her scarred cheek with infinite gentleness. "You've given me more than I ever dared ask for." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. They were standing so close now, closer than they'd ever been, except when riding together. She could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling evening air. "Damon," she whispered, and didn't know what else to say, how to put into words the feelings that had been growing in her heart for weeks. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, to refuse. But Ruby didn't move except to rise slightly on her toes, meeting him halfway. Their lips touched softly, tentatively, a question more than a claim. Then deeper, with more certainty, with the recognition of something that had been building between them since the moment she'd stepped off that stagecoach and chosen truth over deception. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Damon rested his forehead against hers. "I know we said 6 months. I know we agreed to wait to be certain. But Ruby, I'm already certain. I've been certain for weeks. You're not just someone who shares my house or helps with the work. You're the partner I never believed I'd find. You're home." Tears streamed down Ruby's face, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming gratitude for this unexpected gift the universe had somehow given her. "I'm certain too," she managed to say. "I've been certain since you touched my scar and called it a mark instead of damage. Since you stood between me and Clayton Voss and made it clear I was under your protection. Since you taught me to read the desert and trusted me to save Tom's life. I'm not going anywhere, Damon. Not ever." He kissed her again, and this time there was promise in it, commitment, the sealing of something that words alone could never capture. When they broke apart, the sun had set completely, and stars were emerging in the darkening sky. "We should do this properly," Damon said. "Not just living together and calling it partnership. A real marriage, witnessed and recognized. So there's no question about your place here or your right to this land if something happens to me." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Ruby said fiercely, "but if it did, I want you protected. I want it known that you're my wife, that this ranch is as much yours as mine, that no one can question your claim to it." He took both her hands in his. "Marry me, Ruby Jane Sutton, not because of some arrangement or agreement, not because you had nowhere else to go, but because we choose this. Because we choose each other." "Yes," Ruby said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely, yes." They stood there in the gathering darkness, holding each other, two people who'd been cast aside by the world, finding unexpected sanctuary in each other's arms. Around them, the desert breathed its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human joys and sorrows, but somehow blessing them nonetheless, with its vast, star-filled sky and cool sage-scented air. Inside the house, the fire Damon had laid earlier crackled to life, casting warm light through the windows. Tomorrow they would begin planning a wedding, would start the process of legally binding their lives together. But tonight they simply held each other and marveled at the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. This place, this unexpected and precious happiness. Ruby thought of the frightened woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 2 months ago, convinced she was too damaged for anyone to want, too scarred to deserve love or belonging. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another life. The woman standing here in Damon's arms knew her own worth, knew that scars were simply proof of survival, knew that real beauty had nothing to do with unblemished skin and everything to do with unblemished courage. "What are you thinking?" Damon murmured against her hair. "That I came here as a lie and found truth," Ruby said softly. "That I came believing I was second best and discovered I was exactly what was needed. That I came alone and found home." She pulled back to look at him. "And that I would go through everything again. Every hardship and fear and moment of doubt, if it meant ending up here with you." Damon's answer was another kiss, slow and deep and full of promise for all the tomorrows they would share. And when they finally went inside, walking together into the firelit warmth of their home, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that she had found what she'd been searching for all her life. Even though she hadn't known she was searching, she had found a place where her scars were marks of honor rather than shame, where her courage mattered more than her appearance, where she was valued not for what she could fake being, but for who she truly was. She had found a partner who saw her completely and loved what he saw. She had found home. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in December, a date chosen to give the community time to prepare and for the circuit preacher to return from his rounds through the mining camps. Ruby spent the intervening weeks in a state of nervous excitement, sewing a new dress from fabric Margaret Sloane had given her. A soft cream cotton with tiny blue flowers that somehow made her auburn hair look richer and her eyes brighter. But the most unexpected gift came from Damon's aunt, his mother's sister, who appeared at the ranch 3 days before the wedding. Ruby was hanging laundry when she saw the small group approaching on horseback, 4 riders moving with the easy grace of people born to the saddle. She called for Damon, anxiety spiking, but when Damon emerged and saw the riders, his face transformed with joy. He strode forward, calling out in a language Ruby didn't understand, his voice warm with affection. The lead rider, a woman perhaps 50 years old with silver threading through her black hair and eyes that missed nothing, dismounted and embraced him. After several minutes, Damon beckoned her forward. "Ruby, this is my aunt, Desba. She and my mother were very close." "Desba, this is Ruby. The woman I'm marrying." Desba studied Ruby with an intensity that made her want to fidget, those dark eyes taking in every detail from the scar on her face to the calluses on her hands. Finally, the older woman nodded, apparently satisfied. She spoke in Apache and Damon translated. "She says you have the look of someone who has walked through fire and chosen to keep walking. She says my mother would have approved. Desba spoke again, this time pulling a carefully wrapped bundle from her saddlebag. She placed it in Ruby's hands with ceremonial care. When Ruby unwrapped it, she found a dress beautiful beyond anything she'd imagined. Made of soft deerskin, it was decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns of red, black, white, and turquoise. The leather was butter soft, worked until it felt like fabric, and the beading must have taken months of painstaking labor. "It was my mother's wedding dress," Damon said, his voice thick with emotion. "Desba has kept it all these years. She's giving it to you to wear at our wedding." Ruby looked from the dress to Desba to Damon, overwhelmed. "I can't accept this. It's too precious." But Desba spoke firmly and Damon translated. "She says you can and you will. She says gifts are meant to be used, not hidden away. She says my mother's spirit would be happy to see her dress worn by a woman strong enough to stand beside her son." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold. Ruby dressed with Margaret's help, carefully putting on the deerskin dress that fit as if it had been made for her. Margaret braided her hair in an intricate pattern, weaving in small white flowers. "You look beautiful," Margaret said, stepping back to admire her work. Ruby looked at herself in the small mirror, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't immediately focus on the scar. She saw the dress glowing softly in the morning light. She saw her eyes bright with happiness. She saw a woman who had traveled far, suffered much, and emerged stronger. The scar was there, would always be there, but it was just part of her face now, not the defining feature. The church was packed when they arrived. It seemed the entire valley had turned out. Miss Carver sat at the organ, playing softly as people found their seats. When Ruby appeared in the doorway, Damon's face transformed, a smile breaking across it like sunrise. Tom Sloane, recovered enough to walk with only a cane, offered Ruby his arm to walk her down the aisle. They stood together before Reverend Blackwell and spoke vows they'd written themselves. "I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad," Damon said, his voice steady. "To see you truly, all of you, and to love what I see. To be your partner in building our life, your comfort in times of sorrow, your companion in times of joy." Ruby's voice trembled, but held firm. "I promise to walk beside you wherever this life leads. To bring honesty instead of pretense, courage instead of fear, my whole self instead of some false version. I promise to work with you, laugh with you, fight for you when needed. I promise to build a home with you, not just a house, but a place where we both belong completely." Reverend Blackwell pronounced them married, and Damon kissed her while the congregation erupted in applause. When they turned to face their community as husband and wife, Ruby saw acceptance on most faces, genuine happiness for them both. Clayton Voss did not attend, but his absence was noted and not mourned. Word had spread that his creditors had come calling, that his ranch would be sold at auction within the month. The threat he'd represented had dissolved like morning mist under the desert sun. They rode home through the gathering dusk, Ruby seated behind Damon, her arms wrapped around his waist and her cheek resting against his back. When they reached the ranch, Damon dismounted and lifted her in his arms. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said. "It's tradition." He carried her into the house and set her down gently. "I have something for you," Damon said, moving to the mantel. He handed her a small wrapped package. Ruby unwrapped it to find a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. "For your thoughts," Damon explained. "For recording our life together. I know you can write beautifully. I thought you might like a place to put your words." On the first page, Damon had written, "The story of Ruby Jane Warbear, who came west seeking refuge and found home." Written by her own hand, in her own words, the truth as she knows it. "It's perfect," Ruby whispered. She moved close and took his hands. "I don't have a wrapped package to give you, but I can give you this, my promise that every day of our life together I'll choose you. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because you're the best man I've ever known." Damon pulled her close. "We chose each other," he said gently. "That's what makes it real." Later, Ruby lay in bed beside her husband, watching stars through the window. She thought about the woman who'd arrived months ago, frightened and uncertain, convinced she was unwanted. How far she'd travelled, not in miles, but in understanding, in the slow accumulation of small courages that had transformed her. She picked up the journal and began to write by lamplight. I came to the Arizona Territory in autumn of 1879, carrying a lie and a carpetbag and very little hope. I was Ruby Jane Sutton, a woman with a scarred face and a scarred past. I expected rejection. Instead, I found Damon Warbear, and through him I found myself. When dawn touched the eastern sky, Damon stirred beside her. "Can't sleep?" he murmured. "Too happy to sleep," Ruby admitted. He pulled her close, and she set aside the journal. They lay together, listening to the desert wake around them. A bird called from the cottonwoods. The wind whispered through sage. "What are you thinking?" Damon asked softly. "That I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Ruby said. "That everything I went through to get here was worth it to arrive at this moment. I asked for a bride and received a partner," Damon said. "I asked for help with the ranch and received a reason to fight for it. I asked for company and received home." The sun broke over the horizon, sending golden light through the window. They rose together and began the familiar morning rituals. But everything felt different now, transformed by the promise they'd made, by the recognition that they were building something permanent. Ruby stood on the porch watching the sun climb higher, painting the desert in shades of gold. She touched her scarred cheek one more time, a gesture that had become habit. The ridged skin was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a curse. It felt like part of her story, the visible evidence of the fire she'd walked through to become who she was meant to be. She whispered one final truth into the morning air. "I'm not the beautiful girl you ordered, but I'm exactly what we both needed. And that's enough, more than enough. It's everything." The desert wind carried her words away, scattering them across red rock and sage, planting them like seeds in the hard ground where, against all odds, beautiful things grew. From a stagecoach arrival built on deception to a wedding celebrated by an entire community, Ruby and Damon's story reminds us that the most profound transformations often begin with a single moment of truth. Together, they built a life that honored both their scars and their strengths, proving that home isn't a place we find, but something we create with those brave enough to see us truly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.